my goodness, have we got a show for you guys today? Welcome back to the Net.lol podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Brent Salisbury, joined as always by Kyle Mystery, Tom Nadeau, and Dave Tucker. We've got a special guest today. He is an extremely fancy guy. I'm wearing a collared shirt because he's such a fancy guy. It would only be proper. It is the one and only Fred Sue. Fred is amazing. I think we've all worked with Fred on open source projects over the years. He's one of the nicest guys you'll ever meet, and there pretty much isn't a skeleton buried in the valley that he doesn't know about. So he's been failing as long as the rest of us, and so really excited to have Fred on. What's up, Fred?
Hey guys, it's really awesome to be on here. It feels like it's kind of like a high school reunion or something. We've got just a bunch of old graybeards on here who've all lived and breathed this stuff for a long time.
It's glad to have you, man.
Guys.
It's a mess. If we've got millions of followers out there that are going to be listening to you. I'm just kidding. It's Dave's mom. Hi, Dave's mom.
I force my two kids to subscribe,
Yeah.
Yeah, we've all done that, right? It's all relatives. That's who subscribes.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we can up your follower count by about 6. I think we got 6 in my immediate family that we can.
That might be doubling our followers. I don't know.
Almost.
I mean, we do have a sponsor now. I'm just gonna say.
We do have a sponsor now. T1 Nexus have been nice enough to sponsor our podcast. After how long have we been doing this now? Almost a year.
I actually got the domain renewal. It's literally going to be a year on June 23rd.
Yeah, it was like last summer. Yeah.
And this time we don't have to pay for it. So thank you.
Thank you, T1 Nexus.
Wow.
Thank you.
It's a pretty big deal. We're a pretty big deal.
Stuff comes from your big time sponsorships. Now you got money to buy the good stuff.
Yeah, I wouldn't get too carried away with that.
It pays for domain name and our.
We got enough money to pay for a domain name, and
pretty high on the hog.
This is not the Seth Rogen podcast. Not yet.
But yeah, right.
So, Fred, man, one of the things I love to talk to you about is network automation. So, I think we all started this, gave up our day job of kind of building traditional networks about a decade ago. And, we ran down the path of like reinventing forwarding and data planes and control planes and decoupling, when in reality, the true value at the time should have been network automation and how to make the operator's life easier. I'm not saying the decoupling process wasn't important, it still is important. It's incredibly disruptive right now in the worlds of, service meshes and Kube and everything L4 and up. But I think network automation was something I know I personally overlooked early on as being early wins for operators and would have been a better path of kind of pushing the people I was working with at the time to, explore new ideas. Instead, it's like, hey, let's throw out our, centralized control plane. We're gonna do everything in x86. It's gonna work, guys. It's like, what are you talking about? So yeah, where are you at these days on network automation, and where are you evolving to?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think it's a very pragmatic approach to how to deal with the complexity of the network, right? So, I think all of us kind of drank some of the Kool-Aid when it came to various ways of approaching solving network problems and complexity. But at the end of the day, 95% of us are still dealing with CLI, still dealing with configs. How do we make our lives easier as network operators and administrators using the tools we've got and kind of the cards that we've been dealt? And I think, there's still a ton of room for growth. I think we get sometimes, at least I get in a bubble where I'm talking to these folks who are all fancy Ansible users and doing all this great stuff, but then that's like the 10%, right? It's not the masses. The masses are still banging away at the CLI, and I think there's tons of opportunity for improving that operator experience.
It seems like the movie that never ends, right? Like, how can we replace the CLI? How can we replace, right? And it's just like been the bane of our existence. We've had, let's throw some under the bus now, right? I mean, we've had all the previous efforts. What was the latest effort with CLI? The best effort is what, Yang NetConf.
Right.
But that's still not solving the whole problem, right? I mean, that's something some of us have all of us here, I think, have worked on,
Yeah.
Well, and how much of the automation still involves the CLI? I mean, Fred, maybe you can speak to that, but my
Yeah.
guess is a lot.
A lot. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
All of it, maybe.
for sure. I mean,
All of it, exactly. So we're
I'll-
never getting away from it, even with the automation.
yeah, I mean, a lot of the models are still heavily based on the CLI. You might abstract it away to be an API instead of actually typing on the keyboard. Make it a REST call or make it a JSON RPC call or something. But the foundation of it still rolls back into the CLI at some point in time. Getting that initial configuration on there when you want to see what's running on your switch or router, you're still running a show run and you're still grabbing the config off and taking a look at that and parsing that. Like it's
Yeah,
still.
we've literally made the CLI an API now, and we still need automation.
Yes, absolutely.
That should be telling us something.
And hopefully we can get away from, screen scraping at the very least. We see a lot of people getting interested in stuff like OpenConfig and, I guess somewhat better data abstractions, but it's so nascent and it's still kind of limiting from what I see. When I talk to actual real world customers that aren't a major cloud provider, it just doesn't have the depth, the feature sets that they need.
It's never going to be complete. There's never been a standard solution that's encompassed the thing we all can agree on, which is getting harder and harder, I guess. And then all the bits that are left over, the ragged edges as I call them, right? I mean, that you need to automate all of that. That's
Right.
It's always keeps going back to it, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's great if you're a Google and you have a cookie cutter network that all the bits for, and you can prescribe that configuration through an API like OpenConfig, and you're basically building OpenConfig to do that. But for the vast majority of enterprises and network guys out there, that's not the reality. You're dealing with some weird, random CLI thing that you got to put in there, or something that doesn't fit the mold, and then you got multi-vendor issues. And yeah, it's just kind of chaos.
Yeah, and everybody's different too. That's the other thing too. Like it's a feature and a bug, right? In that, some products want to differentiate. They don't want to do and that's the ragged edges that I keep going at. Every time we do this, we see this movie, we go through, we all convince ourselves we've done everything, we've automated everything we need to. A new box pops up that's magic that operator needs to buy, but it's got the extra stuff. So then, then we're back to it again.
Yeah, and another piece of this, I think that I've been actually getting very interested in is tools like Batfish, tools like Forward Networks, all these other kind of tools that let you do some level of validation in addition to just automating the CLI. So starting to take that software engineering mindset and applying that to the network, I think is really becoming really important as we get more and more complex networks, as we automate things. Like automating without unit test type functionality is kind of crazy, because you're just flying by the seat of your pants and you're increasing your ability to break things without some kind of guardrails in place.
Yeah, we're gonna have the Forward people on soon. Winkworth
cool.
and Gary.
Yeah, great guys.
What's your experience with that stuff?
Forward's got a beautiful, beautiful UI, really awesome tool. Some of the kind of the tracing and stuff that they do through the network is really powerful. And I think there's a lot of potential. I kind of look at, like, if I take, not to get too buzzwordy, but if I take like a CI pipeline approach to network automation, and I think of kind of two parts of that we're really lacking today. We have Ansible playbooks. We can generally push configs out, okay. But it's like testing before I push out a change. So something like a unit test before I make a network change, and then testing after I make a change, more of like an integration kind of test. And I think Forward does that post configuration testing thing extremely well, and make sure that, I can set in a bunch of things that I want to make sure the network is doing after I've made my changes.
That's a great point. Like, automation spans not just sort of production environment, but pre-production testing, POC, you want to automate everything,
Yeah,
this
and I
isn't
think
just for production.
if you drink kind of that DevOps Kool-Aid and you see, that they always have that figure eight kind of infinite cycle thing where you just have this virtuous loop of feeding into the automation, doing the testing, pushing things out, and then kind of monitoring things afterwards, and that feeds back into your cycle.
Yeah, we had Jeremy Schulman on and Truman from MLB a few weeks ago. Well, we just published that episode, but that's exactly what he was talking about, right? I mean, you guys remember, Jeremy's whole thing. I mean, the whole thing is automated. Like everything in the stadium is automated, and you don't have to have people pushing buttons and stuff, and it just adds not just infinite scale, but remember he was talking about it also really cuts down on the fat fingering.
Yeah, what really astounds me is that, the CLI is a terrible way of trying to represent all the stuff that goes on in a network device, right? But in the last 20 years, the biggest advancement we've seen is the move from RS-232 to using USB. Like, it's literally, we've changed the damn connector, right? But still fundamentally, it's still a TTY, and we're still forcing you to try and get that information that way. And that was one of the really interesting things about MLB, is that they were saying that when they send someone to site, he might not be a network engineer. Like, he's just the guy, the IT guy. And it's like, you got a network problem, right? I need you to tell me what's on this port. And, trying to talk somebody through, all right, it's okay. Like, you just need to type enable and then type this really cryptic password and then just enter this command without, hit return, don't worry. Like, it's just,
the lights went out. Oh, yeah.
Exactly. If I'm going to have nightmares after that story, I'm now having nightmares. I can't imagine doing that.
Right? It's just no fun. Yeah, flashbacks.
Yeah, I mean, automation gives you guardrails for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, the validation part is so critical to the whole loop, right? Because we're making small changes into this big distributed system that can have cascading failures, and will have cascading failures. So the ability to have rollbacks and canary deployments, and kind of all the things that software has been doing for a long time. I think it's us evolving into it. Like, Fred, maybe give me for those out there that, because I think I think when we start talking about automation, like, we all just start jumping directly into models and, NetConf. And I mean, this is what providers are looking at, but I think that it gets lost in translation to some of the smaller shops where they're like, look, man, I'm having to, configure firewalls, load balancers, routers, switches, Edge BGP. I don't have time to, forklift my shop. And by the way, I'm measured in, my paycheck is based on the uptime of the network. So, what's in it for this giant risk that potentially jeopardizes my job?
Yeah.
So maybe kind of like, what are kind of the baby steps? Tell it to me like I'm the 12-year-old.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I think it's really hard for folks to get started, just to kind of get off the ground. It's a very common problem. And the approach that kind of we've been looking at is start with things that are read-only. You're not going to break anything. Just back up your configs, right? Like, run an Ansible playbook that's going to go through and back up all your configs and store that somewhere. That'll come in handy whether or not you continue to automate or not. It's always nice to have a set of backup configs, and you can set that up as a cron job, run it every day, every week, whatever, and have a nice solid and check it into a GitHub repo. Right now, take it one more step and actually use source code, version control, and check it into a repo, and you're making some headway without having to do all this crazy stuff, like you said, with models and NetConf and Yang and Open. You don't really have to go all that far. You don't have to get a lot crazy. Just do some things that'll make your life easier. And I think the benefit,
it's almost like just basic scripting at the base. The base case is just like duplicated scripting that we've been doing for 20 years or whatever, right? Just
right. Tickle scripts and expect scripts or Perl scripts back in the day. It's the same stuff. It's just different mechanisms.
And the read-only training wheels, I think, is the key there too, right? You're not going to lose your job because you're not going to break the network because you're doing it read-only. That's great. It's great advice.
Yeah, and actually, one of the neat things, I don't know if you guys have checked out the Batfish project for this validation thing. They do all their validation just off of the raw configs. So if you went through and just backed up all your configs and fed them into Batfish, you'd get the ability to do that validation offline on kind of, cold storage configs without touching the live network, and again, without potentially breaking anything. And then that starts giving you the confidence to inch your way forward.
Training wheels.
Yeah, totally. Because I think the fact that you get testing into the loop makes you more confident that the things you're going to do aren't going to wreck the network, right? If I have enough checks and balances in my testing before I push a change out, I mean, we're not even talking config rollback. Config rollback is awesome, but config rollback means I broke the network and I'm trying to come back. If I can assure myself that I've done enough kind of pre-work with the testing to say, yeah, for the most part, I'm pretty confident that these changes aren't going to remove routes where they're not supposed to be removed, or do something like that, punch a hole in the ACLs where I'm not supposed to punch a hole. That gives you a lot more confidence to then start taking those actions where I'm actually going to enact changes on the network. And then again, virtuous cycle, the more comfortable I get with that, the faster I can get. So to your point, Brett, about what are the benefits, you start, as the cycle kind of speeds up, you can do changes faster, more confidently, and with less errors. So it's kind of like you're getting the best of both worlds. You're going faster and more reliably.
It also gives you an idea of what the impact is of talking to the devices too. That's kind of the next step in my mind. You remember, like, you can't just SNMP walk a device. I mean, it may take 6 hours to come back, and the CPU gets pinned to 100%. So that's another validation. You can see, like, get comfortable with the tool, because there's 6 different ways to do automation today, right? At least, right? And they're not all, some are heavier than others, right?
Yeah.
Even forgetting, like, that's the way I look at it. The next step above that is when you get into the modeling and all of that stuff.
Well, I feel like
let's talk to the stuff.
There's almost like an area in between, because I guess the way I tend to think of it, back when I was doing networking, there were kind of 2 things. There was one which was the configuration itself, right, which was usually something templated. The thing on A has to match the thing on B some way, or all the VLANs don't work, or we don't peer, or something, right? And that's something which automation can solve. Now, there was also a funny little bit, which was the runtime element of it, because I would be configuring a routing protocol, or I would be configuring some sort of failover, and I would be expecting a given result. And for me, like, there wasn't really any way of validating that back then, other than GNS3, and let's emulate an entire iOS device and have virtual everythings, because that's obviously the way to solve the problem.
Or Brent's canary model, right? He was talking about,
right?
Like, you got to have a sample network that you can be a crash test dummy, right?
But yeah, I'm wondering though, and this is a question for you, Fred. Like, do we need that? Like, is there some way that we could look at this like differently? Because all of these things, the behavior of OSPF is well documented, right? We should know what should happen if it's configured correctly. So I'm just curious as to whether you've seen, have we kind of evolved beyond having to have a virtual everything and a model network to validate changes, and what can we do to validate runtime behavior?
Yeah, I think so, and not to be too much of a Batfish fanboy here, but that's kind of what they're addressing, right? And Forward to some extent, where they're mathematically modeling your network based on the configs that you're pushing, and then they take that and then they can say, well, this is what your routing table will look like after you make these changes, and they can do a diff, and they can say, well, okay, yeah, this is exactly how things are going to pan out runtime. Now, where I think we still need something, maybe a virtual network, a virtual twin of your network, or even a physical one if you're really, if you really got the resources, is, it's not going to sort out any potential bugs you might have in software or gotchas like that. So,
right.
There's still going to be some cases where you might not catch everything, but at least if things are working the way they're supposed to work, like you said, OSPF is well understood, BGP is well understood. If we're working under the kind of guise of, if things work the way they're supposed to, I at least didn't mess up the config and break something, sort of validation, without necessarily having to spin up a whole GNS3 lab or something else.
Yeah, like vendors are going to write buggy OS code because no code is perfect, right? But yeah, it would be good to at least validate that your mental model of what's supposed to happen with OSPF is actually what happens. Because, thinking back, like, you used to have to, you think, all right, this will probably work. And then you'd have to go and find the CCIE and be like, hey, come on. I've got this idea, right? I think this is going to solve the problem. And then you get schooled and then you realize that actually the thing that you thought was going to work wasn't actually going to work. All. Right?
Yeah.
You can't solve it with that, or it's going to blow something up over here. And there's some of that institutional knowledge, which, is great, but it would be nice to be able to bubble that down so that everybody can take benefit of that. So if there's some way of, kind of failing safely, I suppose, which is one of the DevOpsy things, which is nice to be able to do. We've never really had the ability to fail safely in networking because the stakes are so high.
Right. And I think that also, being able to codify those test cases, just like just like the benefits of unit testing in software, right? Once
Exactly.
you can codify those things, everyone takes advantage of them. They get run through in your CI pipeline every time you're making a network change, so you don't have a regression bug and accidentally pop something open that you weren't supposed to do, and you'd set up a test for that in the beginning. So yeah, it's just trying to avoid errors that might creep back in that you've, like you said, it gets so complex, you forgot that this route map did this thing over here on this other router. And because the network is so distributed and so connected, these things just proliferate through and have ripple effects that you may not catch.
Yeah, I think the algorithmic things those are super important in like a CI pipeline. To Tom's point earlier about having like a full test network or something that you can do. I mean, I don't know how realistic that is for most orgs, but the types of things where you can algorithmically look at the config and run a bunch of things to say, yes, we think this is good, and you get that nice little green stamp on your pull request or something, right? Like that's hugely useful, I think. So I mean that's a pretty amazing advancement to be able to get there to where we are now.
Totally. And I think you go ahead.
So, well, along that thread, that's one of the beauties of virtual networks, right? So basically, all of us are coding on some kind of virtual network platform right now, and we can basically mock up the entire cluster and capture that behavior. But I think it's a lot different when you get into obviously we can't mock up hardware nearly as well. So having those tools, kind of on the crawl, walk, run, I think the next logical step is greenfield. So just like that basic, you've got a pile of pallet of gear on the docks, and you need to take that from blank configs to punching in those configs. What do you tend to recommend people do there?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak kind of to the systems that I work on. ZTP and some of these kind of bootstrapping tools are really awesome because it lets you essentially pixie boot your switches. And if you can kind of, greenfield's always easier from one of these kind of automation standpoints, right? Because you can go in with something that or you can design it from the ground up, right? You're not having to worry about messing up something that's already out there and working. So yeah, if you can greenfield something, that's awesome. The other kind of, it's a very minor thing, but it's also a very useful thing, is just using config replace when you're doing these kind of things, right? It's insane to sit there and have to think, reason through, well, I have to do know this and then know that, and then then put this command in. Like, config replace is miles better from an automation standpoint because this is my designed config, and I'm just going to dump that on the box, and I know exactly what's on that box. I don't have
what you're describing is why, and I think Jeremy was talking about this too a while back. We've gotten to a place where we treat network config like it's code. Right. It's a piece of the code that's on the box, and so all the diffing strategies, like the example you just gave, where you go 4 iterations of config changes, and then you go, oh, wait a minute, OSPF is screwed up here somewhere. You can go back through the version history and go, but I changed this timer back here, and you can check, and that's part of that pre-validation too, where you come into a brownfield and you vacuum the whole thing in. You can probably just examine what's out there today and find problems without even doing anything, right?
Right, and be read-only still in that state where you're not going to actually change anything until you feel comfortable. And I think you and Kyle both are touching on another interesting point. Kyle mentioned the PR kind of attitude, right? For the network folks, that's still another foreign concept, but works really well for this. You branch your code, you branch your configs, which is treated like code. Make your changes, do your tests, run them through the CI pipeline, get a green check mark, do a merge request, fire
you
off a
could
Slack
lint.
notification.
I know people that lint them as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's
Yeah,
just
lint.
code. It's
I think once the network engineers see this in action, I think they're kind of blown away and right, and it's a they like it. I think it's kind of a new thing, but it's exciting.
Well,
Yeah,
it solved two major problems for me, which was, at least in my mental model, one of the problems was when you were working on something, right, you pick up a ticket, you could end up working on the config of the same device as somebody else potentially. And, you want to change something, they want to change something, and now we can at least like merge and rebase, right, which is awesome. The second thing was change control meetings, which you'd always have to go in with your, okay, this is what I'm going to change. This is the opposite of what I'm going to change, and this is what I'm going to enter in if in the event it goes wrong. And now, it can just be a case of revert and bonk, it's done. So it's a very quick productivity win.
Yeah, it's amazing how
you can
many of these
also
things.
tell if you've unfixed something.
Right. No, I was just going to say, it's amazing how many of these things software engineering has solved like a decade ago.
Yeah,
Maybe even
at least.
longer.
Yeah.
And maybe more. And we're still just trying to like get the basics going in the networking world. So
I mean,
there's
it's
there's
a big
lot
boat. It's hard to steer.
completely.
But no, I do love the agility that this brings to it. To Dave's point around change control is incredibly important because, the old adage of networking is in the way. Well, this is how networking starts to get out of the way and can move at the speed of the business. It's just such a. I think it also disaggregates that change control process to where it's actually people that know what they're looking at and like have some clue of what the potential ramifications of a change is, as opposed to just like some drone manager that's just approved some big vSphere change and now he's going to approve a core router change and has no idea what's going on with either of them.
Well, we should
Yeah, I
probably
think the
also
version-
just touch on the user experience as well. Like the fact that GitHub exists now and is very popular is something which is great because when you went to the network team, you're like, all right, guys, I've got this crazy idea. There's this tool. It's called Git. Now you're going to have to learn to use it. And it's really hard because you're going to go and screw things up like at least 10 times before you learn it. Now it's very, very easy. So I think, again, UI-wise,
That's also the
we're
flip
winning.
side. That's what scares the traditional network operators. That this is what we dealt with when we did ODL, where network operators suddenly had to start writing code to control the thing and play with it. That's very scary. Also, especially the more complicated, like when we're talking about getting into models and things, like that suddenly looks like programming to people because it is.
Yeah.
But at least we can take the edge off now, right? Rather than you have to learn this command line thing. It's like, no, there is a desktop app, there is a user interface,
Yeah.
and we can like work you through that right now, which we didn't have like 5-10 years ago.
Yeah, you can, in fact, you can show graphically, what you're going to do too. And like, Fred was saying earlier,
Yeah.
show diffs of what I'm going to change. And then like with the forward network stuff, you can say this is what the network will actually look like and simulate its behavior. That's really reassuring.
Yeah, and then,
Are you
also having the things to check it after you made the change and make sure that things actually did do what they were supposed to do, and you're not in a weird state after the fact.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of potential in tying in CRMs too. I know a lot of people are doing that. Edelman's been focused on that, doing some cool stuff. We need to get him on, but the kind of ticketing scenario where the customer is now bypassing help, or at least your help desk is automated to some degree for like routine turnups, or your technicians in the field instead of having to get on the radio to a high-end engineer for a change, they're just putting in a ticket that's so routine that just gets automated right away. Are you seeing much of that?
Some of the more sophisticated customers, yeah, I think you mentioned Jeremy Schulman and MLB. They're definitely doing some of that stuff as far as I know, and it's very cool when it's working. Like they can the technician can interact with the systems just through Slack, and do what they need to do. At the same time, you can put the right boundaries on them so that they can't mess up anything too badly, right? You have the permission to change the VLAN of that access port, but that's it. You can't go changing the BGP config, or you can't go change the trunk port or something like that. So Absolutely, but when it works, it's really nice. And
But the Slack thing is cool too, because like if you're a field tech, whatever, and you still have Slack running, you can actually see the PR.
yeah,
The Slack bot will show you, well, what changes were made recently. Here you go.
yeah,
And it's very friendly for a semi-technical person. You know.
yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
the Slack bots
And
are
with
pretty
that,
amazing.
yeah, and I mean, I love the fact that we can now kick off this kind of, the CI loop that we've been talking about. That all gets triggered along with the rest of it. So, you do have the pre and post validation. So is our ultimate goal to get to, I mean, I tend to recommend the ultimate goal being towards no manual changes to the network
Yeah,
in case of emergency break glass, right?
totally. And I think that's the right attitude, but I think that also encounters a lot of pushback when we start talking to, your normal network curmudgeon. So that's a challenge. I mean, that's one of the bigger challenges I think with this whole process is how do we kind of cater to the folks who don't want to adopt these changes but still move forward. And I think there's a lot of potential there, but it's a challenging problem to solve for sure.
Yeah, and I think somebody made the point earlier. It's a lot easier, with a Google, right, where you've got this completely homogeneous architecture, right? So like architecture is still very important here because the more templated, the more it can be, horizontally scaled in a similar fashion, kind of the one size fits all. But when you, get into a lot of enterprises where it's, lots of different technologies, lots of different vendors, I think that it becomes a little bit less realistic.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot more challenging to deal with these kind of snowflake environments. And like you said, multi-vendor also when we don't have that standard, that ideal standard that we've all wished for most of our careers, that there have been various attempts to get one out there, but they never pan out.
Can't we all just
I almost
implement
feel,
the same
yeah,
thing
I mean,
for once?
it feels like progress is being made in open source around that, though, right? I mean,
It is.
which
I
is,
mean,
I
I
think,
think.
pretty awesome as an open source.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of downplay OpenConfig a little bit, but I mean, it's definitely trying, and I think it's got some decent traction and some uptick in certain environments.
Yeah, it's been additive. It's just not been the panacea. But
Right.
yeah.
And I look at stuff like, I mean, actually some of the stuff that Ansible is doing is pretty awesome. Ansible's trying to, through the fact that they've got modules into all the different types of vendors.
That helps what you were just talking about. Yeah, like if you've got a network with 3 vendors, you can go, like I use the Ubiquity Ansible playbooks to configure my stuff because I started writing them myself and then I went, oh, there's a whole bunch of these out here. I don't have to do this. That's cool.
Yeah. And as a vendor, it's to our benefit. We want to foster that because we don't want to be the only, box out there that's not Ansible automation friendly. So some of those tools, the DevOps tools like the Ansibles and the Salts of the world, are really helping that move forward as well. I mean, BGP is BGP, but we all configure it a little bit differently. So it's just how do we, again, to your point, Thomas, about the rough edges, how do we kind of smooth out those rough edges as much as we can?
Yeah, cool.
And you mentioned JSON. I think another very interesting piece of this puzzle is that network source of truth. I mean, I don't want to get in the religious war of Nautilus versus Netbox, but starting to put down some type of database that will be the source of, this is where my IP addresses are coming from. This is what
the source of truth or something. Yeah.
Yeah, and having that be something kind of other than just an Excel spreadsheet that everyone else, we all use, it's a big step forward as well. It gives you something to pull on, gives you something to use in all of these different phases of the CI pipeline for your validations, for your config generation, kind of back to that ideal world. If we can make it where the templates just feed off of the source of truth, and it just makes everything much cleaner and more reliable. So great work being done there by, the network to code guys as well as Jeremy Stritch and everything. So some really neat stuff there too.
Yeah, well, excellent. I mean, we're coming up on the top of the hour here. So where can people find you, Fred? What are you up to in the future? And, how can they reach you?
Yeah, I'm still on Twitter. I'm not super active, but I respond if someone pings me like Brent did to join you guys on this. So yeah, feel free to hit me on Twitter. Just out there doing a lot of crazy stuff as always, working on this automation angle, working on all kinds of crazy and weird things, but it's what keeps it interesting.
Awesome.
Stay with it.
Hey,
Keep pushing that
thanks so
ball
much
forward.
for joining us.
Yeah, no, thanks
Yeah.
you guys for having me. It's been fun.
Awesome.
Yeah. Thank
Great.
you for being on, man.
Thanks, Fred.
This is great.
All right, everybody. We'll see you next time. Thanks for joining us, and have a great evening, day, evening, morning, wherever you are. I hope it's great. See you.